Advanced Heroquest, Tobaro's Shame, The Gaol of the Usurper, Part 2. Sven Hamnerhelm tapped his hammer against the side of the adjacent wall one more time, knocking away some of the bloody troll matter that still clung to it, before stowing the weapon and again poring over the map he had discovered. This was his key to both a way out of this oubliette and to sating his vengeance. For somewhere in this jail was his father's murderer, the champion of chaos, Hammerhelm. As he studied the map, he quickly realized that there seemed to be rooms that he had missed, rooms that were hidden to the uninitiated, and the nearest was very close. He immediately peered back out of the long layer he found himself in, into the corridor beyond, and back at the shadowy wall opposite. In moments, his keen dwarf eyes made out the indistinct shape of a door hidden behind a curtain of dead roots. This demanded investigation. He needed resources, or potentially even allies, if he was to take on his captors, kill his mark, and then rejoin his party of fellow mercenaries. In this expedition, the only member of the party was the dwarf, Sven Hamnerhelm, resourceful mercenary and adventurer, who, although thought dead by his fellow heroes, was very much alive and eagerly exacting bloody revenge on the denizens of the Palazzo del Vonto. Sven rolled up the map he discovered and moved straight to the secret door he had just spied. Upon reaching it, he quietly brushed aside the shriveled veil of roots and listened intently. He could hear the muffled groans of someone inside, a human by the timbre of the sound, accompanied by the evil tittering of hobgoblin voices. "Knock, knock! Death is a-rapping at your chamber door," Sven intoned as he kicked the door open wide. The GM flipped over one of our monster generation cards to reveal a layer containing 5 points worth of enemies. To represent these, they then selected a hobgoblin Mongol renegade champion supported by 3 hobgoblin minions. Sven's player and the GM then rolled off for the surprise roll to see who would place the models, with the GM narrowly winning. He placed the hobgoblins close to the door, and Sven's player was then able to move each a single square. The room that Sven had opened was a small torture chamber, and strapped to the rack that stood in the center of the room was a man. He still appeared to be alive. The hobgoblin champion faced off against the dwarf who had so rudely interrupted their torture session and lunged at him with his 2 slitter knives. However, Sven nonchalantly turned the blades aside and smiled. The remaining hobgoblins seemed unperturbed by their leader's poor performance and moved closer to support him. With the hobgoblin in front of him vulnerable, Sven attacked and brought his warhammer crashing into the face of his opponent, breaking his nose and critically wounding him twice. The critical allowed him to strike again, yet another mortal blow, and another point of damage, smashing the hobgoblin into the ground and killing it outright. In response, the hobgoblin opposite from the melee grabbed the sulfuric grenade at his waist, pulled the pin, and raised his arm to throw it. He required an 8 to hit, but instead got a 4 and missed, the projectile spinning past Sven and crashing into the floor of the room behind, the acid within hissing and burning everything it came into contact with. The hobgoblin's comrade in arms shrugged, stepped in front of him and slashed at the dwarf, but two saw the blow turned away by his opponent's high weapon skill. Sven now retaliated and brought his hammer to bear, smashing it into the torso of the diminutive greenskin. It caused 2 wounds, and the hobgoblin doubled up, spitting blood as he did so, but he did not go down. The wounded hobgoblin bared its bloody teeth and thrust its dagger towards the dwarf, but he fumbled. Sven caught it with his shield, knocked the weapon out of his assailant's hand, and struck back. Hammerhelm swiped at the disarmed goblin, and, although it was not a solid blow, it was enough, causing a single critical wound and neutralizing his opponent. The hobgoblin behind, panic gripping him, wasted no time and grabbed the sulfuric scrap grenade from the fallen body of the slain hobgoblin and pulled the pin. However, as he drew his arm back to hurl it at the dwarf, the man, strapped to the nearby rack, sunk his teeth into the exposed wrist of the hobgoblin and caused him to fumble the throw, spraying the greenskin in the foul contents of his own projectile. The burning acid caused exactly 3 wounds, and the hobgoblin screamed as it was burnt to death in its own chemical conflagration. The remaining hobgoblin shook his head in disbelief and rounded the doorframe, brandishing his knife at the dwarf. He too swung, but likewise saw his opponent parry the thrust. There was no stopping the vengeful dwarf. Sven Hamnerhelm struck back. He hit, inflicted 3 wounds, and the hobgoblin neatly dropped dead at his feet. He was growing irritated at such pathetic opponents, and wasted not another moment, moving into the room, shoving the corpse out of his way as he did so. In front of Sven lay a bound man, dressed in furs and threadbare trousers.
Dwarf, please, I saved your life. I stopped that hobgoblin from throwing his grenade at you.
That you did, lad, although I doubt he'd have hit, even without your intervention. That said, you've my gratitude.
I don't want your gratitude, dwarf. I want out, same as you, no doubt. I'm a fighter, a good one. I promise you my blade in escaping this place if you'll but free me from this damned contraption. Would you say? Come on, dwarf.
Sven looked over the wounds the tortured man had suffered. They seemed genuine. There may be treachery afoot, but the dwarf was willing to take the risk. I won't deny that some help would be appreciated. What's your name, lad? And at this point, we took a quick break from proceedings to generate a new hero for a new player. A human warrior, and I have to say that the rolls were particularly outstanding. He got a jaw-dropping weapon skill of 10, a bow skill of 7 that dropped to 5 for his shield and leather armour, a toughness of 7 that was boosted to 9 by the very same armour and shield, 5 great big wounds, an impressive speed of 9 that only dropped to 8 with his leather armour, and both a bravery and intelligence of 7. He was armed with a one-handed axe. His name too was randomly generated, and he got the pleasingly alliterative Lambert Lemberger.
I'm known as Lambert Lemberger round these parts, and that's my axe and shield in the corner there.
Well then, I am Sven Hamnerhelm, lad, and I'll be glad of your axe, especially if it thirsts for the blood of our captors as much as my own weapon does.
That it does. That it does.
And with that, Sven Hamnerhelm took up Lambert's axe, inspected its edge, held it up high, and then brought it down on the ropes that bound the human. "It is done. If treachery be your intent, do it now." Lambert shook his head, took his weapons, and then bowed to the dwarf. "Then, let us be about the important business of freeing ourselves." The party now consisted of 2 heroes, and the first action of the newly freed Lambert Lemberger was to search the room for hidden treasure. Unsurprisingly, there was none. All they found was a plank of wood that had been used in the torture of Lemberger himself. Sven began the next turn by picking up the plank, leaving the room and heading back down the corridor, throwing the wood over the pitfall so it could be traversed without having to resort to taking a speed test. Lambert quickly followed him. The next turn saw the 2 race down the corridor containing Sven's old cell to reach the T-junction opposite. Earlier, Sven had spied another hidden room on the map that lay off to the right, so the pair moved to go and investigate it, rounding the corner to find a dead end containing a door. Sven wasted no time and immediately went to the door and kicked it open. The door opened into a regular-sized room that contained a table full of alcohol in one corner and an old bronze statue of one of the founders of Tobaro in the other. We flipped a monster generation card, and that gave us 4 points worth of monsters for our layer. The GM then selected 4 hobgoblins. With these chosen, Sven's player and the GM rolled for surprise. Both rolled a 7, which meant that the heroes gained the initiative, placed the monsters, and went first. Sven kicked off proceedings and immediately charged the nearest hobgoblin. The slovenly creature didn't know what hit him, as Sven efficiently swiped him with his warhammer, breaking his knee, snapping his arm, and then caving in his skull before booting the body out of the way. Lambert followed the dwarf's example and thrust himself between a pair of hobgoblins, fending off one with his shield whilst coming at the other with his vicious axe, easily getting past the Greensking's feeble attempts to defend himself and decapitating him before facing down the other hobgoblin. The hobgoblin facing off against Lemberger swiped at the barbarian, but saw his slitter turned away by his opponent's deft weapon skill. Upon seeing this, the nearby unengaged hobgoblin skirted around behind the ongoing melee to leap at Sven Hamnerhelm, taking him by surprise. The dwarf had been momentarily distracted by the impressive table of booze in front of him, and the hobgoblin duly hit the dwarf with a critical strike. This allowed him to hit again. Slitter knives caused criticals on both 11s and 12s, but his second blow was parried by the alerted dwarf. Sven's reactions saved him from the blow though, and his shield ensured that the deadly blade failed to do any damage. Sven struck back at the hobgoblin, but the surprise attack had put him off his game, and the hammer blow missed, instead striking down hard on the stone floor. Lambert, on the other hand, had no such problems, and brought his axe swinging down upon the hobgoblin he was fighting, inflicting exactly 3 wounds, and cleaving him straight down the middle. The human warrior then stepped up and tossed the 2 bloody torso halves aside. The last hobgoblin desperately struck at the dwarf, but once again found his attack thwarted. Sven had had enough. He booted the goblin in front of him in the chest, winding him, and then brought his hammer down with extreme prejudice, caving in both the skull and chest of his opponent with a pair of critical hits, and reducing the greenskin to a jellied torso that he then knocked to the ground before grabbing a pair of bottles of alcohol as a reward. Lambert moved to the table and did the same, while Sven searched the room. His keen, dwarven senses soon sniffed out some gold, and he found a small pouch of 20 gold coins hidden on the underside of the table. The two wasted no more time and instead quickly made their way out of the room and back into the corridor from which they'd entered. The subsequent turn too saw them continue back past the T-junction and move up this central corridor. This terminated in a right-hand corner, and the two came to a momentary halt here to peer down the corridor ahead. This corridor was 2 lengths long and ended in another right-hand turn, just as the map had indicated. Once more, the pair threw caution to the wind and raced along to the next corner to see what lay before them. It led to a door on their right, as expected, but what was not expected was the portcullis that barred their way from moving directly along the corridor. Their path seemed to have been chosen for them. It was also at this juncture that the GM rolled a 12 for the roll that they make at the end of every exploration turn. This allowed them to take a dungeon counter, and an ambush token came out of the cup. The two heroes knew that the only way to progress was to go through the door to their right, and Sven moved to open it as Lambert readied his axe. The door opened up to a lair containing 10 points worth of enemies. The GM selected a small coterie of hobgoblins, but also put an orc warlord in charge of them. He then took this opportunity to play the ambush counter he'd just received to add another 2 points worth of wandering monsters, and chose to throw a hobgoblin hero into the mix. The surprise roll easily saw the heroes barge in on the greenskins unawares, and Sven's player placed the models, leaving the GM to move each a single square, which he used to space each out from the others. The room itself was long, just as indicated by the map, and contained a treasure chest and a tall cabinet. Sven kicked things off by charging towards the nearest hobgoblin, the hard edges of his warhammer gleaming in the torchlight. However, it was the very dimness of the room that confused his strike, and allowed the hobgoblin the chance to dodge the deadly blow. As Lambert entered the room, he immediately recognized the white war paint of the orc warlord. It was the beast who'd led the gaggle of greenskins, who had captured him, attempting to leave the city 3 days earlier. He would have his neck. But between the barbarian and the orc lay some hobgoblins. Lambert followed the dwarf's lead and threw himself at the same hobgoblin. The sneaky greenskin was busy evading Sven's attack and did not see Lambert's axe swinging for him until it was too late. The blade caused 5 damage, including a critical, eviscerating the hobgoblin. Lambert then stepped over the body to face the remaining greenskins alongside Sven. The monster's turn began with the hobgoblin to the right of Lambert attacking. Instead, though, he fumbled his slitter blade and left himself wide open to Lambert's counterattack. The axeman did not waste the opportunity and brought his bloody blade down on the foolish greenskin. The weapon caused 4 damage, including another critical, and cleaved the hobgoblin in 2 from the crown of his head to the pit of his stomach. The next act was the hobgoblin nearest the dwarf. It slid up to strike at Sven, but he too, unbelievably, fumbled, dropping his blade at his feet. He stupidly then stooped to retrieve it, and the smiling Sven Hamnerhelm smashed out his brains with a swift hammer blow. The third hobgoblin threw himself at Sven in a wild attack that the dwarf was easily able to fend off, but the distraction gave the orc warlord his opening. Alas for the larger greenskin, he followed the example set by his minions, and his blow completely missed its target. This only left the hobgoblin hero to act. He moved to face off against Lambert and lunged at him with his 2 slitter knives. However, the axeman bashed away one with his shield and hooked the other away with the inner curve of his axe. With his opponent overstretched and at a disadvantage, Lambert struck, embedding his weapon in his foe's chest and inflicting 4 wounds, stopping the hobgoblin in his tracks and killing him with cold precision. This, though, was only the start of Lambert's go, as heroes can either move and attack, or attack and move as a basic combat action, and thus the barbarian came at the orc warlord, whose thread he most dearly wished to cut. Sven, on the other hand, saw the orc looming over him, but, like an eagle that has set its sights on a particular prey in a flock, ignored him and struck at the last hobgoblin. His hammer crashed down on the angular helm of his foe, inflicting 2 wounds. However, one of these was a critical, which allowed him to roll again. Another critical, and yet another roll, giving another wound. The helmet folded in on itself under Sven's heavy hammer blow, and the jagged edges of the armor pieces pierced deeply into the hobgoblin's skull, killing him instantly. Sven then took the opportunity to move out of range of the orc. Only the powerful orc warlord remained, and he was not going to let any diminutive dwarf escape his wrath. He moved away from the axeman and brought his weapon down on Sven. It struck. Sven's lightning reflexes once more came into play, though, and he raised his relic shield just in the nick of time. The sturdy dwarf artifact absorbed all of the damage, leaving Hammerhelm with a sore arm, but no lasting damage. Sven lowered his shield and brought his hammer up into the jaw of the mighty greenskin. It struck true, inflicting a critical hit and dislocating it. The orc was stunned, and Sven rammed the edge of his own shield at the greenskin, but found it blocked by the massive shield of the orc himself. Sven rolled for damage, but although he got a critical blow in, it only inflicted 2 wounds and left the orc wounded, but very much still in the fight. This left Lambert, and this was exactly what he had wanted. He went after the orc with a snarl and swung his axe at the greenskin. It sang as it sliced through the air and found its target. It cut through skin, cartilage, muscle, and bone as it struck, inflicting 5 damage, including a pair of critical hits. The axe ended its journey, clanging against the wall, but what drew Lambert's eye was not this. No, rather, it was the bloody descent of the orc's head from where the barbarian had cleaved it from its neck. The room was clear. It was now that Lambert noticed that the room had no other exits, meaning that the switch for the portcullis back in the corridor must be in the room that they stood in. He moved to the nearby cupboard and swung open its large door. True enough, within was a large pulley attached to a chain. The human pulled on it and heard the ratcheting of a wheel somewhere in the stonework of the walls as he pulled open the portcullis. In the meantime, Sven searched the bodies and was rewarded mightily for his efforts with gold. Sven only had eyes for the large chest in the corner of the room, though. He came upon it as a mountain lion on some cornered prey, and prized open its lock. Inside was a stash of 50 gold coins that he happily added to the stash of gold he'd found on the bodies of the greenskins moments earlier. This brought the total that the two had found up to 280 gold coins, which were added to the 120 that Sven had found earlier. The immediate way ahead was clear, but they still did not have the key out of the jail. And although Lambert had the satisfaction of slaying his captor, this as yet lay beyond the grasp of Sven Hamnerhelm, for Cronthag Hornhelm still lived.